All right. So, we're going to read 36, and the question I have is, what makes a thing good? Thus is Plato led to posit a hierarchical, oh wait, we read that. Now, as has been indicated, the forms as archetypes, or perfect patterns, are the standards by reference to which particular things in the world of our experience count as being the kinds of things they are. What is he saying there? They're all particular things. We have a particular dog, a particular cat. You might have a canine, a chihuahua, but in our mind, we know that all dogs have the same form of dog, even though you have many differences in their particular manifestations, right? For the new people, something I mentioned last time is that sometimes these things are actually very basic. But what people don't always realize is that in philosophy, some of the really basic things, to really understand them completely, are very difficult. So those are things we're going over now. Don't feel like this, that you're dumb because you understand this stuff. These are some of these things people their whole lives, among the early Greek philosophers, argued over. So though they're basic in one sense, they're really complicated to fully comprehend. All right. A triangle is a triangle only because it participates in the form of triangularity. We talked about that last time, right? We can see all sorts of triangles, but it's because we have this concept, this perfect concept of triangle, that we can find individual triangles in the physical world. Same with a squirrel. A squirrel is a squirrel only because it participates in the form of squirrel, and so forth. By the same token, something is going to count as a better triangle the more perfectly it participates in or instantiates triangularity. And a squirrel will be a better squirrel the more perfectly participates in or instantiates the form of squirrel. Hence, a triangle drawn slowly and carefully on a paper with a radiograph and a straight edge is going to be a more perfect approximation than when hastily scrawled in crayon on the cracked plastic seat covered by a moving bus. Hence, a squirrel who likes to scamper up trees and gather nuts for the winter or whatever is going to be a more perfect approximation of the squirrel essence than one which through habituation or genetic defect prefers to eat toothpaste spread on rich crackers and to lay out, sprawled eagled on the freeway. Can you see how this would apply to morality? And anyone can answer that question based on forms. How can we know morality through forms?
We're all humans, right?
Yeah.
And so we all share that humanness in us. However, the more that we imitate and are godlike, we reach more of that essence of that perfection.
Mm-hmm. So another way you could say human nature is man acting most properly the way he ought to act. We tend to say, oh, he's sinning because he's human. Actually, that's a very erroneous statement. The human, to act according to our nature, we act for the good, we act for the true. Every time we sin and act disorderly, we actually act contrary to our nature. We act for the pleasure when we're supposed to be acting for what we know is good and true. Animals can only act for pleasure because they only have the lower powers, right? Man has all the perfections, all the faculties of an animal, right? He has the sexual desires, the food, all that stuff. But he has something higher. He has the intellect. And the intellect has to govern everything. But what he can do is he can understand this ideal of man and conform to the ideal of humanity. And as we're going to see later on, that is the whole foundation for the natural law. Okay. So this entails a standard of goodness and a perfectly objective one. So if we say someone is good, really they're good insofar they are corresponding to some ideal of goodness, right? Our ideal of goodness has to be the ideal human nature, and that's our standard. Big problem with modern forms of morality, they don't really have objective standards of morality to base things off of, right? They're just like, well, I think this is good, or I feel this way. Well, it's all subjective. If you have this nature, you now have a clearly codified, objective form of morality. And we talked in the past about how the forms are unchangeable. Oh, actually, maybe we didn't get to that. Well, we'll get to that later. Okay. So our intellect only knows things that are eternal. Does anyone have any idea what that means? Are the forms in some way eternal?
Well, they'll always last. Like the form of a triangle is never going to change. It's going to be that way throughout eternity.
So when the forms are united with matter, we have a triangle changes shape, color. Humans, right? You're a baby, you grow, you get sick, you're nourishing yourself, you're changing the location. But forms never change and are not even required by God in a sense to exist, some of them. For example, two. Two is just means some specific thing. Regardless of there's a God or not, just hypothetically, two-ness means something. In every universe, in every language, we can use different words to refer to two, but two always has the same meaning. Regardless of all the triangles cease to exist, triangularity always means the same thing. In every universe, you could have a different word for a triangularity, but triangularity will always mean the same thing. Forms in their understanding and meaning are truly eternal and completely unchanging. Hello! We have two more. Oh, well, welcome.
Can you go upstairs and get
I'll
some?
go upstairs and get another. I'll get another one upstairs.
Okay.
You sure? Well, welcome. So, just let you know, so this is the second class, but all the classes are recorded, so I'm able to send you. Did you email me?
No.
Someone emailed me. Okay, I will send me your email, and I will send you the recording from last time as well.
Okay, great.
So right now we're just talking about the idea of a form. Just get you caught up real quick till the chair comes down. A form is an immaterial concept. So you have you have many particular triangles you can draw, right? But you understand this idea of triangularity. So this idea of triangularity is a form, it's a concept that's, so you can, all triangles are isosceles, scaling, or collateral. But triangularity is a concept where all these three types of triangles that exist in the real world exist in our mind in one concept. This is what I mean by form a dog, the idea of a dog. You have a Chihuahua, you can have a Golden Retriever, you have a Rottweiler. But all these things, all these types of dogs share in their dogness. So, sorry, jumping kind of into the middle.
But you start off to the intellect only knows what is eternal.
Yeah, so we're saying the intellect only knows eternal things. And we talk about how dogness is an eternal concept. So like the idea of a triangle-ness, we can use different words, different languages, but it always means the same thing. Even if all the triangles in the physical world cease to exist, the concept of triangle-ness would always mean the same thing. The idea of triangle is eternal and everlasting. Okay, we talked about man's good, so the form of man is a soul, right? And we talked about how since the form of man is a soul and the form is universal, all men have the same type of soul. When we say man, we mean the same thing that applies to everyone. Now, some are taller, some are shorter, some are smarter, but they all have that humanness in common. And because we understand this human nature, this humanity, this form of man, that has to be the model for our morality, because it is the basis for which we can lay everything upon. Okay, so we talked about how the form is the only intellect that is eternal. So everything through the senses is changeable, right? So when we sense things, the walls, everything is always changing. We only sense characteristics of things like colors change, right? Because of that, the highest form of knowledge is through the intellect. It's the eternal, unchanging things. What is known through the senses is of a lesser importance, a lesser in the terms of hierarchy of the type of knowledge we know about things. Now, we do actually know forms through the senses, but the senses themselves can't tell us about the forms. We need the intellect to grasp the forms into themselves. So
I turn the sound down.
doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
Okay.
So there's a hierarchy in the way we sense things and the different things that we know. We talked about how we know man's good, and obviously the goodness of the triangle is how well does the triangle conform to that perfect archetype of triangle in the mind. Okay, so here's a question. So we have the sensible things. Are the passions good or bad? Passions and emotions are pretty much used interchangeably. Are they a bad thing?
No, they're neither good nor bad.
Well, why not? Because it would seem, if we're saying that the passions are this a lower thing, we'd seem to be implying that the passions are maybe an evil, the senses are this worthless thing, and the intellect is all that matters. Why are the passions neither good or bad? What is their purpose? Any idea? Why do we have passions?
To get things done.
Okay, so passions seem to have, all of man is good. His intellect, his body, everything is good and necessary and ought to be there. The passions exist for a reason. Can we look at, okay, so that's good things done. Can we look at particular passions and see things are ordered toward?
Well, the passions are either ordered towards something that's good or something that's evil.
Okay,
Right.
What about hunger? What passion for food? What is that ordered toward? What is the end? Why would God give that passion? Yeah.
So that we would sustain ourselves.
Okay, so nourish our bodies,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
But
Okay.
they can be perverted as
Correct.
well.
Exactly, yep. Or even if you look at the desire to breathe, right? We want to breathe and whatnot, it's to nourish ourselves. The passion of pain, actually very important. If you didn't react when you touch the hot stove, you damage yourself, right? Reproductive passions there lead you toward reproducing the species, right? Now, so we talk about the different types of knowledge. Those things are kind of sensible knowledge, these passionate things, right? But the intellect sees these passions the way they're guided, and they say, okay, they're guided toward a proper end, but I can clearly see the end. If we're guided just by our passions, our tendency is to overeat and to indulge in worldly things too much. Plato talks about the passions, and he talks about it as a charioteer guiding horses. The horses are like the passions. The man who is vicious or without virtue is a person who horses just drag him wherever he wants to go, right? But in the virtuous man, the horses still guide us. They still give us strength to go. If you didn't have empathy, if you didn't have these things, you'd be less likely to do them. But he's like the virtuous man who has the passions moving him to accomplish things. But the intellect guides them and directs them. If you have a well-trained horse, right, but it's guided by a charioteer, it's very useful in attaining the goal that you want to attain. If you have virtues in your soul and you have a properly formed intellect, your passions can help you attain the goals you want to obtain, right? So the passions are not bad in themselves. The passions are good. The passions are useful. They help us with things. Now, the passions are all ordered toward worldly bodily things, reproduction, food, things like that. What they're not ordered toward are divine or holy things. The passions are not ordered toward worship of God and true intellectual love, if that makes sense. All right, they can aid it, but ultimately the higher things are going to only be done by the intellect. Okay, so we need to go over a concept that we've already kind of talked about. We're going to go over it again. Particulars and universals. Anyone have any idea what a particular versus a universal is? Can anyone define that? Want to try to?
I mean, it sounds like a particular would be like one small like example of something, and a universal would be, well,
Overall encompassing.
yeah, that.
Okay, very good.
That's
So,
the word that I
Something
had.
unique versus general.
Yeah.
so forms in and of themselves are universal, right?
Yeah.
That triangle form applies to all triangles. A form of man applies to all triangle. But this particular they can have a form of a phone, right?
Yeah.
But this particular phone is a particular case of that form. When do we get particular cases? When you take the form and you put it into matter. Now you have a specific case. So we have physical, tangible, specific cases. You always have matter.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And this also applies to numbers. So numbers are kind of unique insofar as they apply in a sense that numbers exist apart from God, in the sense that two is just a concept of two and just a necessarily existing thing, right? Two-ness. And we comprehend it. This is where kind of atheist philosophers or materialist philosophers have trouble, because they want to say everything is just material. But concepts like two-ness, what is two? Yes, we can have two things, but the concept of two always exists in the mind, right? If there are only one of everything, we would still have this ability to form the concept of two. And we lived in a universe, so there are contingent things and necessary things, or contingent truths and necessary truths. Necessary truths are like two. The form of triangle is kind of a necessary truth. Now, that a triangle appears as blue or green, it is possible there was never actually a green triangle. It was possible there was never actually a blue triangle. But the potential for triangularity to exist is always there, right? The form of triangle ultimately exists. Threeness ultimately exists, right? So there are necessary truths and there are contingent truths. And this idea that there are some truths that exist regardless of whether or not they exist in the physical world is an argument against materialism. You can see this with numbers, you can see this really any of the forms. Okay, proposition. Propositions are important. A proposition is basically saying this thing is such and such. And propositions are important because it lends to the way we think about things, the way we think about truth. So we all know the same truth. Let's say the sky is blue, right? All nations know the sky is blue, even if it's expressed differently, okay? You have different languages, you have different words. You could say it more poetically, you could say it more basically, right? But the statement, the sky is true, is expressing the same thing, even though it might be in different languages, more poetically. You know the statement, you could say Socrates is a bachelor, or Socrates is unmarried, right? These are the same proposition, even though they are expressed differently. The fact they are the same thing, even though they're expressed differently or in different languages, isn't really of itself a proof of the forms, of the material that we think. We don't just think through material processes, but we think in terms of abstract, immaterial concepts. Or again, concepts that exist regardless of the matter. Okay, So we are now more or less done with Platonism. Any questions over Plato? Okay, so now we're going to go to realism versus nominalism. So what is realism? Realism is the idea that universals, numbers, or propositions exist independent of the mind. So if no one comprehends these things, they actually exist in the world outside of us. Okay? Pretty simple. Then you have nominalism. Nominalism is sadly the philosophy that plagues society. The things outside of us only exist in the mind. The blue sky, that's really just a bunch of particles, but my body senses it as blue. You know, the tables around us, all there are really particles bouncing around, and that's everything. That's really ultimately what the materialist says. But the realist says no, there's something more to reality than just that. There are these forms, these immaterial concepts. And there's actually quite a few pages we can go over that defend the existence of the forms and defend realism. Now we have two types of realism. We have Plato, it's called the kind of Platonic realism. He kind of has an extreme realism where you have all these forms exist in the third realm, of the perfect human exists in the third realm. But there's problems with that. Aristotle has what was called moderate realism. And his realism, he takes a lot of the perfections of Plato, but he makes it more, I would say more real. He applies it more to the actual experiments we see. Now, if you are interested in some of these arguments in favor of realism, Edward Fraser goes through and lists about nine different arguments in favor of realism. I was going to list them off in the class, but I don't know if we'll have time for that. But if you want on your own time, you can go ahead and read them. Okay, so we're now leaving Plato and going on to Aristotle.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I said yay.
Oh, yeah. How significant is Aristotle? Well, I wouldn't want to exaggerate. So let's put it this way. Abandoning Aristotelianism, as the founders of modern philosophy did, was the single greatest mistake ever made in the history of Western thought. More than any other intellectual factor, there are other non-intellectual factors too, of course, and some are more important. This abandonment has contributed to the civilization crisis through which the West has been living for several centuries, and was accelerated massively in the last century or so. And in my class, I've talked about things like the new theology, and a lot of these new movements in the church were trying to go back to the fathers and really go back to Platonic philosophy, and really a lot of them adopted modern philosophy, or not even Platonic philosophy, but completely other modern philosophers. Our whole structure on government, on right and wrong morality was built on these objective standards of Aristotelian philosophy. And we, in many places in the church, they abandoned that and replaced it with other modes of thinking. And there's a opinion of the author of this book, as well as myself, that once you started viewing viewing the theology through a philosophy that's not based on a solid foundation, your theology led you to all sorts of places that weren't good or necessarily healthy. Again, I'm going to go back to what I mentioned last time about a subalternate science. A subalternate science is a science that receives its truths from a higher science. For example, engineering. If you're studying engineering and you have you know engineering perfectly, but you think 2 + 2 is 4.1. When you go to build that bridge, even though your engineering is perfect, because you have that error in your math, the bridge is going to have problems. think something we've had in the church in the past, 56, well, really it's been in there for the past 100 years. It's slowly been sleeping its way in. It really manifest around the 60s and 70s, was this replacing the old philosophy with modern forms of philosophy. And maybe it can be done in moderation in some cases, but in some places you just see a total abandonment of the Platonic, Aristotelian philosophy from modern philosophy. And that was then the foundation for understanding the truths of the faith. And I really think that did a lot of damage. All right, back to the book. So that was our introduction to Aristotle and his thinking, the importance they have. So we're going to go over one of Aristotle. We're going to go back to the philosophy games. We're going to go over what's called act and potency. And this is answering that question we had before. Is there change or isn't there change? Remember last time we talked about how the ancient philosophers were wondering, can there be change or can't there be change? One philosopher said, well, I see change all the time. Therefore, all there is change. There is no stasis. Everything is change. And another philosopher said, look, there's being and there's non-being. So something is, it is that way, and it will always be that way. Therefore, there can't be change at all. Change is merely an illusion. And what are these people doing? They're trying to take what they're experiencing and, figure out the truth. And actually, both of them were wrong. And Aristotle actually solves this problem. He solves this problem through something called potency, a third type of being. So there's things that exist. There's being, there's non-being, and there's potential being. Okay, what does potential being mean? Well, some things have the potential to change. So let's take gold, for example. Gold has certain characteristics. It has to have a certain color, a certain density, a certain hardness, a certain weight. But gold can change in its shape, okay? Gold has the ability to receive certain characteristics in its shape. Let's take another example. Let's take a cup, right? Let's say you have a cup, and if you want, you can break the cup. Why is the cup able to be broken? The cup is able to be broken because the parts in the cup are able to separate when enough force is applied to them. Now anyone ever play a very old game, video game? And very old video games, you can have cups and all sorts of stuff, and you can hit them, you can drive cars into them, and they don't move. They don't change, okay? But why? We don't think about this. Why don't they change? Why don't they break? It's because those aren't actual cups. Those are just the way the code is written. Those cups don't have any potency. They can't change. Now, in newer games that are more advanced, the coders put potencies into those objects. They can now have ability to receive different types of colors, different types of things. They can change, right? That is a view of potency. So in theory, God could make this phone, right? He could produce this, right? And he could make it that this is the only way it could exist, which means that no matter what you do to it, it can't be destroyed. But when God made the materials in this phone, he made it so that with a certain tension, a certain force, it has the potential to change. It has the potential to change its existence. Let's take copper, for example. Copper is a certain color, right? But within the potency of copper is the ability to change its color to a certain greenness. Why can copper do this? Other things can't, right? Gold always stays the same color. Gold really can't change its color, to my knowledge. Gold can't change its color. But there is something of potency, a type of being within copper that gives it the capacity to change its form, the way it exists. Now, it still exists as copper, right? But it can change some of its attributes. And really this having potency, we tend to think of potency as, well, it's meaningless, it's just saying things can change. No, potency is a type of being inside of something. The copper has a type of being in it that gold does not have, because the copper has the ability to change its color, where gold completely lacks this ability. Gold only changes color because it's dusty, but it doesn't rust or anything like that and change its color. Okay, any questions about potency? Like you mind, these are abstract, very complicated concepts. We're doing a lot of them very fast. So don't feel bad if you don't fully understand these concepts. What's really important though in a philosophy class is not that you fully get these things. Some of these basic things, I didn't read it till I read through, the fourth book of Aristotle's Physics. But what's good is that you're getting these concepts and you're slowly starting to think about them and you're doing philosophy, okay?
So Aristotle solved the problem by saying, okay, there's potency. So
Good question. I didn't answer that. You're right. So what he says is, though, you might have a thing with the form of gold and the form of copper and the form of plastic. There are also accidental forms, okay? So there's what's called the essential form and the accidental form. So think of blueness, right? You can't see blueness walking down the street. You can't see softness walking down the street. Blueness exists in something. Softness exists in something. Gold has certain, the essence of gold has certain accidents, right? A certain color, a certain weight, a certain tension, a certain hardness, right? Each substance, each thing has certain accidents. How do I know gold? Well, if I look at gold, I can sense these different accidents, and since it has these accidents, I know it's gold. If I know it's a wood, wood has a different set of accidents, right? The sounds it makes, the color, the shape, the softness, the hardness. That's how I know gold. So though wood may stay the same wood, it can change, not essentially, but usually it changes accidentally. It might be a different temperature. At one point it might be a different color. You might burn it, now it changes a different color, but it's still essentially wood. Okay? Water, you can have water. Water, you might put something in, a dye might change its color. You might change its temperature, now it's frozen. Now water's hard, but it's still essentially water. I can take water from anywhere, and because I can understand, if I take a bucket of water, right, and understand the properties of that water, once I understand waterness, I can then find water anywhere, and I can understand how that water will also work. Okay? And this is actually the problem with modern empiricism, is that once you have materialism, you don't have these immaterial concepts. I can do the experiment on this water, right? But if I don't claim to understand the essence of water, then that water over there could act different than this water over here. So only by understanding this essence, this immaterial concept of water that applies to all water, does my empirical science give me any useful information. Okay, that's a little more complicated, but we can go over that if people want to understand that better. Okay, it is not fun to see.
Does that example have any kind of relationship to like ideas or thoughts? Like, for example, I don't know why it keeps coming to my mind the fact that, like, for example, when I talk to my liberal friends, they don't care about morals. They don't care about like, oh, you like that? Go ahead. Oh, go whatever, do whatever you feel that it's good for you, But now that you've explained the things about like specifics and universals and how some things are eternal and some things are not, sadly, life is like more complicated than just do whatever you please and do whatever you like.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit more like something might have its accidents, but it's also something that it has its eternal, so you should like, you know,
Yeah.
take one of each, something like that.
So what your friends need to do is, instead of being like, well, how am I gonna live? Most people are just how they feel. What they need to be thinking, okay, how is man? What is the ideal man? And base that on how I should. What is my nature? What is my nature telling me I ought to live? And use that as a guide to live. And we might all have different characteristics, right? Some might be taller and shorter. We all, regardless of our accidents, we all have that human essence, and we're all bound to live by that human form or essence. Does that make sense?
So it's almost like separating, like we said before, humans from animals, where they may have passions and we have passions. However, the animal does it because it feels good. And you hear in the world, you know, oh, it just feels good. Where, yeah, maybe it feels good, but is that leading us to the better good? And that's when you don't do those things because it gets in the way of the better good, right?
Yeah, basically people are living like animals. They're not using their intellect to determine what is the good I need to be embracing. Yeah, it's a shame. It's kind of basic, but when you really think about it, it's like, wow, actually, that's how it works. Yeah. Okay, so one thing, so we talked about act and potency. So one thing that is true, a thing can never actualize itself. Okay? If you had the power to actualize yourself, you would. Now, that's kind of true with man. It's a little bit different than living things because they're kind of a complex system of things working together, right? But in terms of inanimate objects, they can never actualize themselves. They're always actualized by something outside of them. And really, this is also true with man. Something outside of actualizes something and makes things go inside of us. But for example, let's say the phone has a certain temperature, right? Its temperature is not going to change unless there are things outside of it actualizing it, right? So if it wants to get cold, you need something outside of it that's cold that's going to cool it down, or something that's hot that's going to heat it up, right? So all potencies. Sorry, we didn't talk about act and potency. I'm getting ahead of myself. So toward act and potency. So there are two types of things that exist. So something actually exists or has potential to exist. Okay? So we have, sorry, I've been using that word. So we have things that actually exist. Like this phone case is actually red, but you could heat it up and it would change its color to blue. And those things are a certain temperature. They're actually a certain temperature. They have potential to be a different temperature. You have what's called first act, first potency, and second act, and second potency. So a first potency and a second act are the same thing. So a first act means I actually have something, right? A second act means I have the capacity to do something. Let's say play the piano, right? Someone who has no skill to play the piano has what's called a second potency to play the piano. As a human, I have a potential as a human to play a piano, right? But if I've never practiced a piano, I don't have what's called the second potency, or first potency, or second act to play that piano. Does that make sense? So you can be a potential in one sense, a potency in another. Sorry, an act in one sense, and potential in another. So, for example, you actually have the ability to play the piano, right? So only once you actually have the skill to play the piano are you in first potency to play the piano, okay? This act and potency, can anyone see how this applies to the abortion debate, or the debate of whether or not retarded people are still human? I mean, completely retarded where they're just vegetables. And it's maybe less than retarded. I don't know if there's a word for that. we're going to see how this could apply to that. I think you'll better understand the potency. You want to give it a shot?
Well, the child in the womb still has the potential to become an adult like you and I over time.
Okay, so that's the answer. So, we can, if there's a dog or even a plant, right? We can just kill the dog, we can kill the plant. There's nothing wrong about that. It's not someone else's dog, but if it's a dog attacking you, right, should be no qualms about killing the dog if it's gonna harm you. If it's a human, then there's different things you have to consider. So, if you look at what separates the man from the dog and the plants, it's the parts of the soul. Now, in the very early stages of the baby, right, it doesn't have the perfections of a human yet. It just has the perfections of a plant. It doesn't even have the perfections of an animal. It can't sense anything. It's just barely living. Now, the materialists will say, look at this thing and the plant are the same thing. There is no difference there. Or look at this plant, it can't reason yet. At this point, this is no different than the animal. And the answer is that here's the reason why it's completely different. Because that thing has a human soul, and that thing has the potency for intellectual behavior. The dog has no potency for intellectual behavior. The animal does. Let's say someone is brain dead, right? And they're acting like a vegetable. And some people say, well, they're a vegetable now, that we should just cut the life supports. There are certain cases where you can do that, but under most circumstances, you can't do that. And the reason why, even though they are functioning like a vegetable, right? They can't even use their animal abilities. They still have the potency. Deep within them is the potency for intellectual activity, and they are still fully human. And because they have that potency, that being in them, even though at this point they can only act like a plant, they are still more value and have more value and worth than a dog. Does that make sense to everyone? Is that a little confusing? Okay, so you can see how potency, it's a real type of being. That person who's a vegetable now has a potency for intellectual activity that the dog will never have. It exists truly inside of them. Okay.
Could that be why the argument that people want to make that the unborn child is a person doesn't seem to sit quite right for me? I mean, because you could say, well, a dog is a person too, and then therefore you can't kill a dog.
They can't reason.
Well,
So wouldn't it be better to just recognize that the unborn child is a human being, which has the potential
yeah.
to become
The fact that
an adult?
it has the fact it has a potential for the intellectual activity is what makes it a person.
Oh,
And the
okay.
fact that that's at the core of what a person is. An
But
individual.
has the law
So the
defined that?
exact definition of a person, an individual substance of a rational nature. That's confusing, but it's basically an individual that is rational. And in this case, it's rational in potency, where a dog is not rational in potency at all. Make sense?
Makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so act is actually always prior to potency. Okay, so what does that mean? Act always exists before potency. It's in terms of the degrees, the perfections of it, act is higher than potency. And because potency always presupposes that something actually exists. So if you're gonna make something hot, it presupposes that heat actually exists. If something has potential to become red, it's presupposing that there actually is redness that exists, or yellow or soft. There's actually a softness that can exist. So potency always presupposes actuality. Okay. Okay, we already talked about first and second potency, and so you can see brain dead. Okay. Now we're going to go to matter and form. And we've talked a little about this already. we have matter and form. And I said before, matter is what allows things to change. Now, this actually wasn't in the book, but I'm adding this because I think it kind of gives you a more complete understanding of the Aristotelian. Oh, actually, matter and form was. I think the 10 categories was not in the book. The word accident was not in the book. That's what I've added. Okay, so matter allows for things to change. So like I said before, we have these universals, right? We have triangle. Well, the moment you draw a triangle, now that triangle exists in the matter, right? You have this concept that actually exists in the real world. We can understand the concept of gold in our intellect, but it's only once that concept is in matter do we have actual physical gold, right? And to dogs, cats, or even humans, right? You can understand the concept of a soul. Only once that soul is put into matter do we have an actual physical human. Aristotle has what's called the 10 categories. The 10 categories is a way of characterizing everything in the physical world. So, or all the attributes of a physical object. So he has what's called the first one is substance, the thing in of itself. This is gold, this is copper, this is plastic, this is wood. The other 9 categories are called the 9 accidents. Those are things that are said about, those are predicated of the substance, or those are said about the substance. So that's like time, shape, color, quantity, quality. I don't have them all memorized, but there's 9 different accidents. And they just say the way that that substance exists. Does that make sense?
So the accidents make the form?
Well, no, the accidents, they don't make the form, we're getting close. So the form is the concept, right? So
And
basically,
isn't the concept made up by those things?
it's kind of the opposite. So the concept of triangle is actually triangle without any non-essential accidents, right? So you have the actual triangle, it could be blue, it could be green, it could be so big, it could be so small, it could be thin, it could be thick, right? But the concept actually has none of those. The concept is one concept that encompasses all those things in one concept. But whenever you have a physical triangle, it has to have certain accidents, right? So it has to be blue or some color. It has to be some thickness of the lines, right? So does that help you understand it? So when we take the, when we come to know substances, the forms, we see cell phone, and we take this idea of cell phone in our mind. And when the idea of cell phone in our mind, it removes all the accident, the non-essential accidents. So whenever we see a cell phone that's similar to this, that's like, oh, that's not exactly like my cell phone, but I can see that still has cell phone-ness in it, right? So, and we know that, okay, by understanding the cell phone, it could be blue, it could be black, it could be big, it could be small. But understand that regardless of it, it still has a cell phone-ness inside of it. So the form really is without accidents. Now, there are certain proper accidents that always follow certain forms. Whenever you have gold, it always has a certain atomic mass, as far as we know, right? Whenever you have man, there's certain essential accidents that make man, right? He'll always be living, he'll always be physical, he will always be within a certain height and size. If he was 1,000 feet, the man just can't live in that way. 2 inches, man can't live that way. Have certain organs are essential for man, right? He has an intellect, right? And there are certain accidents that flow from man's essence. Humor, not all men have to laugh. Maybe something could be wrong where they can't laugh. Based on how man ought to be, he should have the capacity for humor. He should have the capacity for sadness. He should have the capacity for other types of emotions, for forming intellectual thoughts, for thinking for various things. Though these aren't necessarily part of his essence, they flow from his essence. Does that make sense? Okay, so I have substance versus artifact, and I think we're going to not talk about that because I think that at this point maybe a little more confusing. It wasn't in the book either. Okay, we're gonna go finally the last thing. We're gonna go over what's called the 4 causes. And this actually is something that really changed the way I look at a lot of stuff. When I teach kids in my high school, I don't talk about the 4 causes, but I do go over the 4 causes with them just because it's a good tool to explain the real world around us. And give me 1 second. I'm going to get this fired up. It would be nice if we had a whiteboard in here, but we don't. So we'll have to do with the monitor. But, well, there's not really room for one in here. Oh shoot, I don't. Tell it on my phone.
Your phone's down.
Yeah, a little hot in here.
Yeah.
Yeah, the heat's actually on.
Oh, the heat's on?
Yeah, you can feel the heat.
Oh my goodness, what were they
I wonder
thinking?
we're all getting like.
Yeah, it's a thermostat. Heat's actually on in here.
Last time I was in this room and the heat was on, it like makes a lot of noise in this room. It goes like pop pop.
Like it's on 0 now, it was on 3.
I don't know. No, do you want to sit over there?
It took a while, but I started
Yeah, it's
chapter
better now with
3.
the door.
I did.
Door open and
I was on a roll.
heat turned on.
I like his examples.
Then we can share.
You know, like.
Examples always help to
Yeah.
illustrate something.
Yeah.
I think he's a good author. He's good at explaining things.
Yeah. He kind of talks to you like. parts of it.
Well, these are hard things to understand, to go from, because we're all taught materialism, to break back into realism is a hard thing to do. Alright, hopefully this is the right file.
I was just thinking that as I was learning these concepts, I'm like, wow, I just took all of this for granted.
Yeah, because this is so foundational,
Right.
right? Because and everyone actually has a philosophy. You're either materialist or realist. You grow up with one or the other, but most people don't really think it through. When we're thinking through these very basic things, they're basic, but they really have a huge impact on the way we look at everything.
And you know,
Hopefully, when I did the morality thing, did it kind of clear that up? How much of an effect this has on us, even though it's very basic.
and they want to make AI sound almost like a person. But when you're going through all of this, it's just so easy to break it down and say, "Oh,
Yeah,
it's not."
AI is technically not is impossible. Like, there is zero potency for true AI. You can kind of imitate, but depending how you code it. But true intellectual thought requires an immaterial intellect. Materials are computers are purely material, so they might go way faster in certain things like math, but they can never truly comprehend immaterial concepts like we can. Okay, so now we're going over the 4 causes. See if we can do that. Probably won't work. Okay, so the 4 causes are the agent, final, formal, and material. Can everyone see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, so the agent is the person. We're talking about something. So you can take rocks. Let's do the car. So the agent is who made it, right? The final cause is the purpose of this thing. The formal cause, the form, the idea, and the material, the stuff it's made out of. And really, a full definition of most things require all four causes. Okay, so we have a car. Who made the first car? Well, Henry. Now, we could have multiple agent causes, right? In one sense, Henry Ford kind of made the first car. Ultimately, God is the agent cause of everything, so far as all forms are ultimately in the divine intellect. But he's more remote, right? We're more here present. You could also say agent intellect could be, different people on the assembly line. They're more of an instrumental agent cause, right? Final. What's the final purpose of a car? Is the ability to transport. Okay? Next, formal. I said blueprint, and that's not a perfect analogy, but it's really the form of car. The blueprint is kind of this idea of the car you're trying to produce, right? And the materials are metal, glass. Now, how do you judge the goodness of a car? Is it goodness?
Very subjective. Like some people judge it by like how fast it goes. Some people judge it by how many people it can move.
Well, there's
If it accomplishes its final purpose.
Right, so really it's accomplishes its final purpose. So you can have like a van, right? We could put van instead of car. Then this changes a little bit. It's still because a van is a type of car, right?
Yeah.
So ultimately, if you have a van or a Ferrari, and let's say you have a beater car, right, and a Ferrari, and the beater, the engine works. It's not the best, but the engine works. And you have a Ferrari, beautiful Ferrari, the engine doesn't work. Which car is more goodness? Clearly the beater, right? Because it fulfills the end of transportation.
Yep.
Now, obviously, if both work, the beater or the Ferrari is better. Okay, but the final cause determines how good a thing is ultimately. So we can also look at this from the view of man. So man, the agent cause is God. We can say parents, but kind of just like the assembly line, those people are the agent cause of man. It's kind of similar to how parents are the agent cause, because so though Augustine believed that the soul was kind of just given by the parents, it was later been infallibly declared that the soul is created by God alone at the moment of conception, created from nothing. Okay, so God created us. What's our final cause? To love God. Okay? And our form is a soul and body. How do you get an actual car? You need a blueprint with the material, the glass, the plastic, whatever. You just have a pile of metal and glass and plastic. You don't have a car. You need the form. If you just have a body, you don't have a man, you need the soul, right? And how do we determine the man goodness? Man's goodness has to be determined by his final end, which is to love God. And no, this is really basic when you look at it, but this is a really useful tool to look at this and break things down through this chart, because it'll make things make a lot more sense. And those people know this. I think a lot of times that our final end is to love God, people don't always think about it clearly. Okay, that's the end of today's class. Are there any questions?
This was like a basic for us to understand the rest of the book, or is it just about the chapter yet?
Well, so these are so the book is ultimately refuting atheism. And this is laying down some basic philosophical statements so that when we go up against these atheists, we can be like, oh, look here's the philosophical problems you have with your arguments. Here's why our arguments are true.
Is there a possibility there is an atheist that is realistic?
A realist?
Yeah,
Atheist. I don't know. I mean, even among the ancient Greeks, they had their atheists. Democritus and Lucretius, they were materialists, and they were actually atheists because of the materialist philosophy.
Right. So they probably are always materialists.
I never heard, it's possible, I never heard of a realist atheist, but perhaps.
And it seems like a lot of the atheists that study this then become Christians.
Yeah, Edward Phaser did, so is
And-
one.
Right, and the ones that don't, the argument, the atheists that argue their sides, but they really don't study the other side.
There might be a few philosophers that do, but those are very rare. There's one here in the book, Edward Phaser is quoting, and he basically says, why am I a materialist? Because I know I have to hold this to believe atheism. And if I wasn't a materialist and didn't defend it, I'd be confronted with a God. It's a scary thought. He was at least an honest atheist. But he's saying, this mindset, this worldview of Aristotle conflicts with my comfort of being an atheist and not having to live by any moral standards. So yeah, because really, once you get into realism, you kind of have to have the standard by which you live by.
What are we going over next week?
Next week we go over chapter 3.
Okay.
And
Makes it pretty easy.
yeah,
Chapter
well,
week.
we'll see how much I'm going to do because I kind of go through it, and we'll probably be doing half, to be honest. What is the chapter on again? Yeah, we'll see. I probably won't do all of these. So to do these arguments for God's existence, they're complicated. So a lot of people like to give the unmoved mover arguments, but people who aren't trained don't always do it correctly, or they leave out important elements of it. So we're going to go over those arguments, and we have some philosophy now, so we can actually talk about really the unmoved mover. You need to know the concept of act and potency. Then you can really begin to understand that. So next week we're going to be going over the arguments to prove God's existence. All right, any other questions? No? So just so you know, you guys are new. I had a class last week. I record all the classes. If you want to give me your email, I can send you a link, and then way you can see everything.
Okay.
All right.